The following presentation is brought to you by the Realm Network.
It's right about time again to swerve again, confuse the general fans again. Add another swerve and then...
Oh shit! It's Vince Russo!
Vince McMahon's best kept secret.
I am the Antichrist of professional wrestling!
David Arquette won the world title!
I've got a wife, 3 kids at home, and I really don't need this shit.
How can this show be so awful, Mr. McMahon? I didn't think it was.
Viagra on a pole match.
And Hogan, you big bald son of a bitch, kiss my ass!
Judy Bagwell on a forklift match. McMahon, the family, The Rock, they screwed us all.
Now, you're the editor, right?
Mankind did it! Jumpy, beat me! Goldberg steered Russo out of the cage.
I'm from New York.
I'll get downright nasty.
This is Vince Russo's The Brand.
This is a guy that perfected what I think is a lost art in professional wrestling today. And everybody knows, I grew up on Long Island. I grew up in the early 70s. I grew up, when managers were the thing in wrestling. Now, this guy wasn't a manager per se, but he was more or less, in that position, in that slot at ECW, the guy that told the stories, the guy that was getting stories across, the guy that had the personality that you love to hate, the guy that portrayed, the heel in a way that we don't see too much nowadays. Now, I'm talking about, like I said, ECW. We all know the history on the East Coast. He was there from the beginning to the end, I believe. We're going to get into that. But I'm talking about the one and only Mr. Joel Gertner. Joel, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm doing all right, Joel. I gotta tell you beforehand, I'm gonna wind up butchering your last name because my wife's maiden name is Gertner. So Gertner is stuck in my mind when I know that it's Gertner. So if I butcher that, let me apologize to you now.
No worries. And Mike Gertner, right, with the Rangers. So as a local New Yorker, that too. Yep.
Exactly. Now, Joel, are you talking to me from Brooklyn right now?
I am, from no sleep till Brooklyn, BK, all day, every day, the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, just like many great people, like I think Tom Selleck's character in Blue Bloods and Elliot Stabler in Law & Order SVU, and a number of real people as well.
Now, Joel, are you born and raised in Brooklyn? Because I was actually born in Brooklyn. I went home a couple of months ago. I did a show for the Maximo brothers, and I could not believe how built up and how beautiful it was, especially the area around the Barclays Center. Are you born and raised in Brooklyn?
I am, yeah, and South Brooklyn, not far from Long Island or some parts of it. The other side of South Brooklyn from where I live now and from where I went to school. So Southeast Brooklyn, Marine Park, near some other neighborhoods like Mill Basin, Bergen Beach, near the Kings Plaza shopping mall. But yeah, born in Brooklyn, and like one of Mike Tyson's homing pigeons, I leave and I always come back.
Now, let me ask you this, Joel. How has it changed for you? I mean, being a guy that was, raised there, still residing there today, how has Brooklyn really changed to somebody that's been around to witness it all?
I think there's a divide now between South Brooklyn and North Brooklyn. North Brooklyn gets that kind of presentation as being a place for hipsters, certainly. Hipster millennials, you've got your Williamsburg and your Greenpoint and everything like that. So that's, the subject of people are calling it gentrification. And it's now a bedroom community, kind of a suburb, young professionals, young hipsters, the creative element that works in the city, especially downtown in Manhattan. They can just jump on the L train and they can be in North Brooklyn. So some of the neighborhoods in that part of Brooklyn are now different than they were. let's say in the 80s. This part of Brooklyn, South Brooklyn, seems like maybe it'll never change. Some spots of it do seem to be, I don't know, Bay Ridge is kind of similar to Park Slope, which is closer to being in North Brooklyn. A lot of businesses that succeed there. Some of them do well here as well. So it's a nice kind of neighborhood. But Brooklyn is that kind of place, man, where like every quarter mile, like every 5 blocks that you go down the road, you're in a completely different neighborhood. So, you know, it's not too big. It does have a population, though, of about 2.5 million. And it's got to have at least 100 different neighborhoods, if not more.
Now, Joel, here's what surprises me. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. I know a lot of people, you know, from Brooklyn. Then I grew up basically on Long Island. But Joel, you don't come across as like the Brooklyn, you know, Gavone or the Brooklyn Jooch, you know, which brings me to a question that blew me away about you. But, you know, bro, I had a feeling, so I wasn't surprised, but I didn't know it was to this level. Bro, you're an extremely intelligent guy that went to prep school, and then you went on to Cornell University, if I'm correct, which boggles my mind because when you talk about, you know, Jooches and Gavones, there's a lot of them from your backyard that were part of VCW. I know them all personally. I still have arguments with them every single week. You did not, by any stretch of the imagination, seem to fit that mold. So the first thing I want to ask you, Joel, is now I'm assuming you grew up a wrestling fan, but going to prep school, then going to Cornell University, was doing something for a living in the professional wrestling business even on your radar, or was there something else you wanted to do with your life?
I was a lifelong wrestling fan. I started watching when I was about maybe 8 years old or so in 83 or 84, around the time of the nationalization. But, you know, we've been getting along real well so far, and I just want to kind of set the record straight because, for example, if you don't think I got any spot cheam in me, you just got to know Vince Russo. For example, number one, I'm a chameleon, Vince Russo. Number one, and the one thing you got to know is if you don't think I got any Guido in me and that I don't personally know Vinny Boom Butts myself, we're going to have to step outside. We're going to have to maybe, I don't know, dance, throw hands, something. I've been a fan forever. Grew up on WWF, and then Coliseum Video was burgeoning at the time. So as I was continuing to watch every week and focus on the present into the future, catching up and enjoying the stuff from the past, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, if you were lucky, a little bit of Capital Sports and everything else. So I tried my best to be a historian from the beginning. When I have a hobby, I get into it pretty deeply. So, but yeah, no, just grew up, you know, started watching in 83. I'm, I think, only a couple of years younger than you are. Geographically, we're also from the same vicinity. And as I was cutting my teeth, I started around my 16th birthday. So that's going to put us at about September of 91. For a year or so before that, I was a tape trader, did the convention circuit, that kind of thing. Listened to a lot of radio shows. That's where, you know, in addition to seeing Paul Heyman when he was younger on WCW, I didn't get to see much of his territory stuff being from New York City. So a lot of what I got to hear from Paul Heyman was actually on Long Island radio shows like the Pro Wrestling Spotlight that you co-hosted. So yeah, you know, we've probably got dozens and dozens and tons of mutual friends. But yeah, wrestling was always on the radar. Wrestling was the theme of my bar mitzvah, and wrestling was, you know, there was never a greater moment of magic for me. My first show was at the Garden, January of '86, right before WrestleMania 2, Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage in the main event. Savage beat him, I think, by countout. Hogan was about to hit Savage on the outside. Savage pulled Elizabeth in front of him. Hogan stopped himself. And then a few minutes after that, wound up getting himself counted out or disqualified. So Savage went over.
Joe, I got to stop you for a second. Was that the first time the two ever met at the Garden?
It probably was the first time they met. And it was also, it was like to the month, it was the 2-year anniversary of when Hogan won the belt.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if that was the first time that Hogan actually lost defending the title, because he didn't lose the title, right? Disqualification. But he lost the match.
Joel,
and
I was at that show. I was at that same exact show. And let me tell you the two things I remember about that show. And again, Joel, listen, I don't know where you stand on wrestling today, but like I'm getting hammered by some people because like I know what pro wrestling used to be. It's not that today. I'm sorry. It's not what I grew up on. It's not Attitude Era. It doesn't represent that today. But let me tell you the two things I remember about that show that are very significant. One of them is, Joel, I can remember being in the Garden that day and the Garden physically shaking. It was shaking for Savage and Hogan. That's how excited the people were about the product. You couldn't buy a seat. The place was shaking. Bro, here's the second thing I remember, Joel. The greatest sign I've ever seen in the history of professional wrestling. Somebody held up a sign at the Garden that actually said, Elizabeth is a Butana. And I thought that was the greatest thing I ever saw in my life, Joe.
That's funny. That's awesome.
Joe, I got to ask you this. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. No. It was a great. For me being my first night there, it was just magic. It was everything was a big deal. Howard Finkel gets in the ring. I want to announce that at this time we have broken our curfew. Just little stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah. Ron Shaw's in from Philly. Little stuff. And I think it was also the debut of Superfly Afi, and I think everybody thought it was Jimmy Snuka until Finkel announced him again at the end of the match after he won and said Superfly Afi, and there was kind of a little bit of a sense of deflation almost because of Snuka being a god in that building, but he came out, he ate fire, so he was good with everybody.
Hey, Joe, I want to ask you this. It seems that growing up, though, listen, prep school in Cornell, that's nothing to sneeze about. It seems to me you are a very gifted student, very, very intelligent young man. When you break the news, now you grew up with this love of the business, but when you break the news to your parents now that, hey, you know what, maybe I want to make a career out of this, what was their reaction to that?
I don't think they should have been surprised. I think it's the kind of thing that they would have seen coming. I don't know. Part of me thinks maybe there was a reverse psychology aspect where maybe, if maybe they pushed me away, maybe I'd, be put in a corner and need to succeed but they were supportive in a sense that, it was just, it was whatever you think it might have been, except probably not as good or as bad. But, they let it be known that, you probably don't need a college degree. You don't need to go to Cornell to kind of as a prerequisite for being in the professional wrestling business. So they kind of, let me know that the risk that I was taking, was not just a personal risk, but also after, they spent money on my education for private high school and for Cornell, they just kind of, wanted to make sure that if I was taking the gamble, I guess, they never said this in their words, but I always treated it as, this is your shot, make the most of it and do what you can and, show up every day because the juice has to be worth the squeeze. It was a pretty big risk, I think, that I took leaving school. I knew that, I could always go back and finish the degree. But if, this opportunity never presented itself again, then I think I would have rather regretted doing it and looking back than years later regretted not doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can understand that. Now, Joe, I grew up on, I like to call them the big three. And I think it was probably just a little bit ahead of your time. To me, when I was a kid, probably started watching WWF at about 12, like back in 73. The big three to me were, Albano, the Wizard, and Classy Freddie Blassie. And, you can't, today, that's when people argue with me today, like, I can't even do those guys justice talking about them. Go watch a Wizard interview with superstar Billy Graham. Then come back and talk to me about what professional wrestling is. But Joel, that was probably a little bit ahead of your time. And I kind of, to me, you were a throwback, to greats like that, fast forward to the late 90s and 2000. But who were some of the personalities that you were influenced by early on?
Definitely the managers of that era, all three of them, as well as guys, the kind of the next generation, I think, was, and as well, when he got there, Jimmy Hart. And then, from there, Paul, Jim Cornette, pretty much all of the managers, all of them, J.J. Dillon, Gary Hart, they were all so different. They were all there because they served a purpose individually and had their own kind of character. Some of them were leading an army. When you're leading an army and you have all these international guys, sometimes if missing link is in your stable, I guess interplanetary guys, wherever parts unknown is. But when you're leading like Paul Jones's army, to me, that dictates that you're looking for global domination, when you're a J.J. Dillon type and it's the Four Horsemen, it's a corporation of sorts. Sometimes it's a mix between the two. It's like a Devastation Incorporated or something like that. But it seemed like every manager had kind of, the end was always the same. It was always evil, but it seemed like they all had their personal stamp and their unique motivations on how they thought they were going to get there. So I enjoyed all of the talkers, the outside the ring guys, the hype men, the ring announcers too. Howard Finkel, very instrumental in why I enjoyed wrestling and what I emulated along the way in my indie days and also in my early ECW days as a ring announcer and lucha ring announcer. All those guys. And when it came to wrestlers, guys who could talk, Piper, Ventura, guys like that. Also just unique, interesting, kind of freakish guys that you wouldn't see online at the supermarket, like Missing Link, Kamala, George the Animal Steel. And my overall favorite was Jake Roberts, because for what I was looking to pro wrestling for, which was the kind of character that you wouldn't see regularly anywhere else on television. In a day before, Raymond Reddington of the Blacklist and everything like that, you could see a guy like Jake Roberts, and, I enjoyed his in-ring work. And then, of course, on the mic, all of his psychology. He was just, if pro wrestling is a physical and verbal language where you're telling a story, I think, Shakespeare, one of the masters, would have to be Jake Roberts.
Joe, let me ask you this question, I wrote a column the other day and I took a little bit of flack for it. And basically, what I said in the column is, with the death of Roddy Piper, when you look at Savage Piper, Dusty Warrior, when you look at the passing of those four, to me, it was almost like the passing of Roddy signified the death of a professional wrestling era, for my generation, that we perhaps will never see again. And, as we move on and wrestling goes into, 2020, somewhere along the line, more of the emphasis has really gone on wrestling. And away from characters and storylines and what it seems that you and I grew up on. Let me ask you something, Joel. Why was it? What do you think it was that people like you and I were really more drawn to the talkers and the ones that told the story? And I love the way you said that. The person that you would never see online as a grocery store. What do you think it was about us or our personalities or maybe even that time that drew us to the character, whereas today more and more and more it seems to be going in the way of the in-ring action?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one because, wrestling, in the wrestling business, this is something I say, when I teach a seminar, because I'm not, between the ropes, and I'm not really, when I'm teaching a seminar, thank God, doing anything physical. You wouldn't learn anything there. But I always say that, it's the wrestling business. And even though wrestling is a noun, and even though, it is, wrestling that's on the marquee, when it's the wrestling business, wrestling becomes the adjective. What type of business is it? It's the wrestling business. But at the end of the day, effectively, it's a business. If you look at other businesses, like, for example, I compare wrestling oftentimes to a restaurant. Surprisingly so. I know you don't get a body like this by accident, but Paul would make comparisons. He would say what makes ECW successful is that when you go to an ECW show and you're seeing, let's say, 8 different matches on the card, it's like our equivalent of a restaurant giving you kind of a taster's menu, a sampling of like an 8-course meal. Mm-hmm. So you'd have comedy, you'd have technical, you'd have brawling, blood, flying, girls, nostalgia, everything. And if wrestling truly is like a restaurant, then it's really debatable. I mean, we can figure out, you and I, since, like you said, we both enjoy talking and the verbal storytelling, and kind of that you don't get that part from anything that isn't wrestling. But if we were to ask other people why they watch wrestling, I think we'd probably get as many varied answers as asking people, why they go out to eat, what they like best. Is it the quality of the food? Is it the service and the fact that they don't have to cook? Is it, and probably even more so, because some people watch the wrestling for one specific thing, and some people probably enjoy it because it's more of a variety show where you get the action and the athleticism, the physicality, you get the talking and the acting, and you get, the story and just the, the pomp and the circumstance, man, the music, the pyro, the everything. So why I was drawn to the talking, I don't know. I've always thought television was the greatest medium for telling a story, maybe rivaling, going to Broadway and seeing something live, or going to a house show, or going to taping, seeing something live. I've always thought television is just, it's kind of that magical, mysterious box that you almost, you suspend disbelief for a moment, and you think the people in there are looking right at you, or you wonder, what could I do if I was in that box and could get my hands on, so on. But I don't know. I mean, I've always loved television. I've always loved live television. I've always loved stuff like game shows, just the kind of surprise and just people's reactions, not knowing what's going to happen in advance. I've always liked unscripted television, which surprises some people that's, kind of hand in glove of why I love pro wrestling. But I've always just loved kind of, the surprise element. And just, talking too, like, growing up, late 80s, early 90s, huge fan of the Morton Downey Jr. show, and aside from stuff like pro wrestling and Piper's Pit, you never got a lot of that anywhere else on TV, but where you sought it out. You had to know where to go. And that's why for me, wrestling was gold, because I knew that Saturday morning cartoons were never going away, because kids would always want to see, the animation, the colors, the stars, it'll never die. It's been around forever, and it will be. Wrestling, we've got to protect it, because we've seen similar things and not be successful and go into huge downturns. And I just knew that pro wrestling I wanted to support, because, I knew where to find it, and I knew what I was looking for, and I knew I'd always get that out of pro wrestling.
Hey, Joe, you mentioned this. So I got to tell you, there is a phenomenal documentary on Morton Downey Jr. on Netflix. Did you see that?
I haven't yet.
Oh,
I haven't yet. The last documentary I think I saw on there was about Below.
Yeah, no, now, and that's a great one too. But there's a great one on there on Morton Downey, man. I mean, you popped me huge when you brought that up. I was a huge fan of the show. You'll love it, bro. It's absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah. Hey, Joe,
I remember when I first heard about YouTube like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That's like one of the first things I popped in after looking for every wrestling promo under the sun. Morton Downey Jr. Well,
I got Joe, there's a lot of similarities between you and me. I think you're a lot younger than me, bro. I mean, do you like talking about your age? You don't like mentioning your age?
Oh yeah, I don't have a problem. I'm actually going to be 40 in a
Yeah.
few weeks.
I was going to mention that September 20th, you're going to be the big 40. I'm actually 54. So, like, I'm almost 15 years older than you.
Come
But,
on.
yeah, there are so many freaking similarities here. So now I got to assume you got to be a huge Stern guy with the cast of characters on that show, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, big Stern fan. I had a buddy in high school that was a huge Stern addict, and I could always, if I missed an episode, he was the guy that I could go. The same, I guess, role that I played in wrestling for a lot of people, where they knew if they missed that week's show, they could come to me and hear about it, at length. Is the same way, my friend Dave was. But yeah, Howard Stern, big inspiration on me. Actually, I got to meet him once. At a personal function. I think it was a bat mitzvah or something like that. And he was a cousin of the bat mitzvah girl. I got to meet him there. But I mean, just, a media genius, just a guy who, went from being a co-host, parallel with you, right, Vince? A guy who, just, got his foot in the door and just, made it to the very top. And just, amazing. And yeah, I've read Private Parts, seen the movie, and I've gotten to befriend, so many members of that kind of whack pack clique. It was actually a blast last year at Caroline's Comedy Club. Got to be kind of a sideline correspondent / instigator / intelligent Jew number one for the Iron Sheik roast. And that was an unbelievable time. But yeah, Howard Stern, if you were growing up in my neck of the woods, when I was there growing up, he was on Up Against Saturday Night Live on Channel 9, WWOR, Saturday nights from 11 to 12, got a sponsorship from Snapple when they were first coming up and going from local to national, even did a pay-per-view on New Year's Eve. So very much, similar to pro wrestling, just kind of started local, got himself national, and took advantage of all of the different platforms that were available to him. So, and now has his own network and is his own universe within media. So just an amazing talent. And yeah, tons to learn from by listening to him.
Now, Joe, you're gonna pop me huge, or you're gonna disappoint me here. And this is maybe a little bit before your time, but I'm gonna throw something totally obscure at you that I've never brought up with anybody else on the show before. I don't know if I could. Even some of, the New York ECW guys. Now, we're talking about Stern. We're talking about Morton Downey Jr. There was a very popular cult video show that was big on Long Island, but actually was out in New Jersey. Does the Uncle Floyd show ring a bell?
Yes. Yeah, well, I didn't get cable. I didn't get cable until, September of 89-ish. I was about 14, and I think maybe the first pay-per-view I got was like Fall Brawl 89, Halloween Havoc 89, stuff like that. So when I was watching wrestling 86, 87, 88, in Brooklyn, if you wanted to see anything but WWF, with a rare exception of, I guess Channel 11 had NWA and Glow, AWA, because they were doing the Pro Wrestling USA at the Meadowlands, stuff like that, Pro Wrestling This Week. But great place to watch wrestling, but only for 1 hour every day from 6 to 7 p.m. was out of New Jersey. And yeah, the Uncle Floyd show was great, but obviously, what brought me to U68 and put it on my radar in the first place was being able to see, it was a different wrestling territory every day of the week. A couple of those days, I think, was NWA Worldwide and NWA Pro. They had California Championship, and I think they had World Class and maybe Mid-South, UWF also. But what a great time to be a wrestling fan. But yeah, U68, if you wanted to see, some kinds of wrestling that you didn't have on the dial or on cable, if you didn't have MTV yet because you didn't have cable, U68 was the thing to watch.
Yeah, I actually think that was the first place I saw wrestling, because I remember going to a UHF channel, because at that time, people don't understand. There were 13 channels. And when there was nothing on the 13 channels, you had to go to UHF. I think that was the first place I saw wrestling. So, Joe, how do you make the connection then to ECW, going back to 95?
Yeah, I had been to a couple of shows. I was following it in the newsletters, radio shows, and I was watching some of the TV when I could. I went up to school in '93, but at the sports, we had MSG on the cable system up there, and then if you went to a sports bar, you could very easily see Sports Channel Philadelphia. So I was keeping up with it. Had some friends that worked there. Because, I met Devin Storm coming up in the business, Jason Knight coming up in the business, Chris Canyon. So I met a lot of the local guys who did some work with ECW. I was at the show where Shane wrestled Tully Blanchard and maybe one or two other shows as a fan. And in '95, ECW did a show in September of '95, a couple of days after my 20th birthday, and it wasn't so close to Cornell, but I was hoping that wasn't going to be an issue when I spoke with Paul in August, the month before the show, and I was there in Philadelphia attending the show and hanging out at the hotel after, and just kind of making new connections. I saw Paul in the lobby, and he was standing near the elevators. And I thought to myself, well, if he goes into the elevator and if he goes up to his room, I might not see him again. So I basically gave the equivalent of an elevator pitch outside an actual elevator without knowing it was called an elevator pitch. And I just, peddled my wares. And I said, Paul, I probably invoked your name because I said, Paul, I've been listening to you on the Pro Wrestling Spotlight, and I've been watching you on Channel 11 and, admiring your work from afar. I've borrowed some of it if you don't mind. And, we have some mutual friends, but the reason I want to just take up a moment of your time is that I go to Cornell, and I know you have Middletown coming up, and I know that your ring announcers and your timekeepers, they're local out of Philadelphia, I think, and I'm not sure if they're going to be making that trip or not, or if you would kind of just be looking around for somebody.
Wow,
if
Joe,
that's the case.
What a great angle to come from. You know what I'm saying? I mean, what a smart way to approach them, and knowing your background and knowing your facts. I mean, that's kind of who you are. I mean, but what a great way to approach them.
I guess I was either, too stupid to know better, or just, or wise enough to know that if I was going to approach him at all, treat it like I only had one chance, because I only had one chance. Mm-hmm. So it was essentially that. And it just ended with, basically I just wanted to kind of give the, the intonation of, if it's not stepping on anybody else's toes and taking a spot that's already filled, I'd like to, audition, or I'd love to, whatever, ring announce. That's what I do on the indies. He kind of looked at me. He was like, "You want it?" And I was like, well, "Yeah, of course." He's like, "You got it. Be there by 5." Wow. And I was lucky. And I was
well, yeah, and good for Paul Lee. I mean, listen, man, I know that, this business is so built on, keeping good people out and protecting spots and cock blocking, and what a I mean, that's a great story that he gave you an opportunity.
Yeah, I'm thankful all the time. I really do owe it to him, because 4 years on the indies, it was tough only because it was the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of college. So it was tough because, it wasn't the kind of thing that I could do, 4 days a week. It wasn't the kind of thing that I could necessarily do each and every weekend. So it was just hard to kind of not have any semblance of structure, or a place that in the wrestling business that you're full-time, you're regular, that you belong, that you don't have to ask if you're booked on the show next week, that kind of thing. Not that anybody would ever confuse ECW with structure, but again, compared to those 4 years on the indies, it was, and certainly, I'm always thankful for that.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that structure in a minute, but before I go there, I want to back up a second. Now, Joe, obviously, you had mentioned you grew up on the WWF. ECW was a much, much different animal than the WWF that you grew up on. I mean, I can say that because I was there while you were there. With that being said, and you were used to a WWF product for so many years, what was the original appeal you had towards ECW?
ECW was, I liked that it was overboard. I liked that it was extreme. The part of me that enjoyed U68, right? And Morton Downey Jr., Howard Stern, the part of me that loved those things, ECW was the wrestling incarnation of that. Aside from that, again, you could find a little bit of everything at every live event that we did. Everything that's enjoyable about wrestling was extremely enjoyable within ECW. The characters, I thought, were always developed impeccably, whether it was through the Pulp Fiction montage or any other, individual loose segments or montages that there were, but just everybody had a chance and a moment to shine. And if you had the charisma and if you bought into yourself and had the confidence to know that an informed wrestling feeling to give you half a chance would get into your character, it was a gold mine. It was a golden opportunity. But everything, the budget was very shoestring. It was very grassroots. So a lot of people, the pyro, let's say, and we didn't have much of that, but I think we made up for it with the music, because a lot of people started to love wrestling when the music kicked in, with Junkyard Dog having music, and the Freebirds and the Road Warriors had Iron Man, and World Class had music videos, and everybody, the AWA, everybody brought music in. And then with the WWF, them being tied in with MTV, and with the nationalization and the rock and wrestling connection, music, starting in the early 80s, late 70s maybe, became a big deal in professional wrestling. And, whether we had the rights to the music or not, or it was a barter, or it was a handshake agreement or what, you got all of the music you could ever expect to want from ECW and then some. And I think that a lot of that, the fact that ECW was not only visually and for the action, its own kind of brand, with its own kind of brand loyalty that was unbelievable, but it was also the soundtrack to many people's lives. People can sit in the car now, turn on the radio, and they hear Enter Sandman or Man in the Box or Come Out and Play. These are great songs stand alone in and of themselves. The first memory that a lot of people have, that I know, when they hear those songs, takes them right back to ECW. And it made the Dudleys interesting because we were the one act that didn't have music, and maybe that's kind of what made us heels too, is that it was just, it was silence and well, and me on the mic and Bubba on the mic and the fans starting a riot, and there was no music. So I think the music, also social media, there wasn't a lot of what there is now. A lot of the Web 2.0 and a lot of the, more advanced social media apps weren't around. But even when it was just the World Wide Web, and even, before, even back to AOL and Rexport Pro Wrestling and everything else in the 90s, CompuServe and Prodigy and everything else, ECW was doing CyberSlam and putting together, kind of fan conventions, Q&A panels, that kind of thing. And if you jump into the Wayback Machine and hit up the Internet Archive online, at a time when even WWF and WCW, and I'm talking the real early days of the web, 95, 96, 97, when their stuff, looks just as much beta and just as much Atari as everybody else's, it's not that we were leaps and bounds above them, but we were definitely holding our own in the cyberspace side of the planet. So, ECW just did what it could with what it had, and that's it, man. It's it's charisma. It's just making the most out of the least, being the underdog, but never making it look schlocky or hokey. And just, it's why, the Wrestling Observer, right? They've got their awards. And when I was growing up, every year, the most charismatic wrestler was Hulk Hogan. And the definition for what the requisite was for getting a vote to be most charismatic wrestler of the year was to be able to make the most out of the least. And Hogan knew he was going to be in that ring doing that leg drop 300 times a year. So it wasn't all about going out there and performing in that All Japan style that he knew he could 2 weeks out of every year. It was making the most out of doing the least. And ECW had to do that out of fiscal necessity.
Hey, Joe, let me ask you this question, because it seems, again, when I look at your background, when I look at prep school and I look at Cornell, correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be totally off base. But I kind of get the feeling that, as a student, as a college student, up until the conversation with Paul, you seem like a pretty straight-laced, intelligent type of individual, who's a wrestling fan. Would that be an appropriate description of you? Or were you doing things at that age that I would never peg you for, or I couldn't even dream of?
I did a few of those things, I guess. Pretty normal childhood, but I don't know.
Here's where I'm getting at, Joel. Like, listen, ECW was a zoo in front of the camera and behind the scenes. I mean, no question about it. I worked with many of the guys, you worked with, but I never worked with them in an ECW locker room. I worked with them in an environment where there was some structure and some control. I can't imagine what happened or what went on in an ECW locker room with some of the ECW people that I worked with. I can't even imagine. Honestly, I probably wouldn't even want to hear some of those stories. But was that ever difficult with you? Just the environment and it being a zoo and that crowd, at the ECW arena, and then who knows what, going on backstage in the locker room. And there wasn't a Vince McMahon. I mean, I'm sure it was, there were problems. Guys took care of the problems themselves. I'm sure they were probably doing things in the locker room maybe they wouldn't have done in a WWF locker room. Was that environment ever like, holy crap, like this is a 3-ring circus? Or did you just have no problem fitting into that lifestyle?
I adapted. Here's the thing, whether it's an Ivy League college or whether it's community college, when you're of a certain age and around, people and having fun and hanging out and away from home and everything, you're going to have some fun. It's going to be wild. It's going to be interesting. So I think the end of it that I was more concerned with is I wanted to belong and I wanted to feel, I guess for lack of a better word, accepted. And I didn't want people to think that I was, this kind of straight. I didn't want it to be like 21 Jump Street kind of, but almost in reverse, where like, be careful, this guy, you know what I mean? Like, just on a number of different levels, because, the people at the Lower East Side Wrestling Gym that I was around that were trainers and that owned the place, these are guys going back to, WWF from the beginning, 60s, 70s, and these are grown men, when I was breaking in at age 16. And I was always taught that way that we were all taught in the early 90s, which is, obviously respect everybody. You have, 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a mouth. Use them in the right proportion. Only talk, it just, so what I didn't want to be the case in ECW is that people, I kind of kept to myself at the very beginning. That's how I wanted to kind of, for the first little while, I wanted to be egregious. I wanted to be friendly and I wanted to be, jovial, but at the same time, I didn't want to come off like a goofball and I wanted to make sure it was handled the right way. So I kind of kept to myself and I was a bit reserved and a bit shy until it got to the point where it was a point of diminishing returns. I don't know if it looked like I was forcing it and for the wrong reasons, but I felt like, people were kind of like, they mistook it for a sense of conceit or arrogance. I was understood to is conscious of roalizing that, number one, I was, with a few exceptions like Juventud Guerrera when he came in, Kimona Wanalea, Roadkill, with a few exceptions, I was always the youngest person on the roster. So I was always cognizant of the fact that, those first couple of years that I was in ECW, I was 20 and 21 years old, working with guys who were in their, just older than me. Some of them twice as old. Some of them had kids my age. So I was always respectful of that. And also just naturally, when you're an ancillary guy, you know, when you're an outside the ring talker and you're not in there, you know, boots on the ground and the guns, you know, at you, you know, I mean, you know, I took a chair shot here and there in 5 1/4 years, and I took everybody's finish. But it doesn't mean it's not the same thing as all of the blood, the sweat, the tears, and the fact that these guys are physically debilitating themselves so that I can eat. So, you know, I was always cognizant of things like that. And I would, I guess, trend, you know, towards governing myself accordingly in a certain direction until people started to maybe misread that. And if I ever felt misunderstood, then I would just kind of, you know, show a little bit more of, you know, I always tried to be the real me without it being the kind of thing that would rub you the wrong way, because I'm an only child, which means, you know, I'm okay in small doses.
Yeah, I totally understand and get where you're coming from. Hey, Joe, I got to ask you this. Listen, I was at WCW, and you know, you knew it was over. You know, Time Warner, we knew the writing on the wall. We knew they were trying to sell the company. We were given a heads up that this thing is over. I think that's, you know, the situation right now at TNA. You know, I think the talent has, you know, there is some indication that may come to an end come September. In other words, it wouldn't be a big surprise to the talent there. You were at ECW to the end, and I'm curious about this, Joe. Like, were there signs that the end was coming near, or like in your shoes, being a guy that was there from 95 to the end, did it seem to just come out of nowhere? Because I'm just, you know, having not been there, I'm just curious of, you know, a promotion that was so over and so popular and so hip and so cool, you know, that should have continued on for all the right reasons. When it came to an end, was it a gradual build, or did it kind of come out of nowhere?
Depends how you measure, and I think different people. That's a real perception and reality thing, right? It's not about what you're looking at; it's what you see. Some people were more. It has to do with whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty, or there's a glass, or just whatever. But for every sign or indication that we got that it might be over, or it could be, there was always hope. You know, we're talking to this outlet, we're in the midst of negotiating, we've got discussions going on this. It was always kept alive. You know, there was always, I don't know, it was, for me, being there the 5 years that I was there, the exact 5 years, that window, what was interesting about it, and I don't know that I really have thought about this until just now in the moment answering your question. When I first got there, there was no guarantee that the risk that I took leaving school was going to be worth it to me, or that the promotion would catch fire and get even bigger than it was. And it was kind of like when I came in 95, there was all the potential in the world. Anything was possible, but there were dangling carrots. And then for a few years, ECW got to the point where we got pay-per-view. We got past the controversy and the scandal. We got video games. We got Pioneer Home Entertainment. We got San Francisco Toy Makers. We got a magazine. And with TNN and everything, and going national and going up to Canada, and, you know, guys going on tours, it just, all of a sudden you didn't need to have a dangling carrot, because it was the place to be. And if you didn't want to be there and were talented enough that you were worth it in the marketplace, at the end, what I'm realizing now is that it was almost like the dangling carrots came back, but they were always there, you know, and they always were legitimate for all that we knew. And so again, you know, depending on, you know, either the level of hope you had, or what you knew, or what your option, any of a number of different things, that would be your personal, you know, ability to measure whether you knew things were coming to an end or not. I think I knew when, because I was, weekly, I was part of production for TNN. And then after we didn't have TNN anymore, I think I was kept with Joey either regularly or more often than not back on the syndicated show on Hardcore TV. So in addition to being on the road at the tapings and the pay-per-views, I was also once a week at the studio doing production. And for the last pay-per-view, that January one at the Hammerstein, they were still running screens during the show saying, Living Dangerously coming in March. And I was in the truck watching some of the show from there. And at one point I was leaving the truck and I was going down the steps and I saw Paul, and he came up to me and basically kind of nonchalant, matter of fact, just, putting it out there and talking, mainly about scheduling for production. He just let me know that, after this show, after the pay-per-view, there was going to be a little bit of downtime. Mm-hmm. And I just, I guess, for me, that was kind of, I guess, I can't compare it to the TNA situation because I'm not there and don't know exactly what it is. But I guess for me, there was a certain light bulb when I heard that there might be some downtime, because in over 5 years, it's the first time I had ever heard it. And I remember when I went back into the building and up the stairs, a couple balconies and in the locker room, I sat there on a couch in the back, and I was managing as baby faces Joey Mercury and Christian York at the time. And I remember I was just hanging out, and I was sitting there, and I looked completely, I guess, a little bit deflated, and almost, I just kind of teary-eyed and just kind of shaking my head. And they asked me, they're like, what's wrong? What's up? Something upset you? And I just looked at them and I said, if only you guys could have, been coming around like 4 years earlier, because I felt bad that for all of the guys that had just started in like, late 99 or 2000 or whatever, I just felt bad for them because a lot of them could have had some good years in ECW too. So.
Okay, so now, Joel, a door closes there, unfortunately, with ECW. I would have to think, at this point, do your sights turn to WWE? Is it maybe I just want to take a break from the business for a while once the reality comes to fruition that ECW is closing its doors? Where are you at that point in time?
I was very loyal to ECW. It was where I got my start, and if it could have been where I spent my entire career at the time, I would have been okay with that. So I wanted to continue to be loyal. Paul gave me a break, and something that I always realized is that with WCW, Paul was in his early to mid-20s. They put him on TV. They made him a co-host, color commentator. When Paul got TNN, he made me at the same age when it was his product, when it was his investment. He made me co-host, color commentator. He got to work with guys like Rick Rude as manager. I got to work with Rick Rude, thanks to Paul, doing kind of point counterpoint, like a protagonist, antagonist on his television. He got to work with the Universal Heartthrob, Austin Idol, who was my favorite talker, up there with guys like Lawler, everybody in Memphis. I loved his work. One of my favorite 5 promos is an Austin Idol promo. And then comes time to give me a nickname because my character is going in that direction and I'm becoming a heel with the bow tie and the neck brace and everything. And the nickname that Paul picks for me is Quintessential Stud Muffin, which is an homage to Universal Heartthrob. So if I didn't want to be loyal, I would have been loyal anyway. But I have to be me, so I had to be loyal. And so it took me forever to even ask for the release. It wasn't in January that I asked. It was probably closer to March when WCW closed its doors, which meant that it was really too late to go anywhere. I had called there. I had spoken to Terry Taylor, I think, in the entire five and a half years from 95 to 2001. I'd spoken to him twice. Once or twice, and then again for Hardcore Justice There was maybe one, maybe two opportunities to show that I could have proved myself within ECW, but I never took them. So for me, I did reach out after asking for the release, but the only thing that led me to ask for the release is before asking for it, I asked Paul. I said, Paul, and I basically told him what I just said, a couple minutes ago. I'd be happy ending my career in ECW. I don't want to go anywhere. There might be interest. And in case you tell me and put yourself in my shoes. I don't want to ask. If you were me, what would you do? If I need to ask for a release, let me know. But if there's reason not to, give me any reason not to ask for a release. And he, not in a heelish way, not in a way where he was, what are you being disloyal? I'll kick, nothing like that. But, I guess in whatever way made sense at the time, he said, well, I can't make any promises, and, this could be it. And, if you want to release because somebody else is looking at you or whatever, then let's talk about that. So that's the only reason I asked in the first place. And again, just based on the timing, I think WCW had already been canceled off Turner Television. Maybe it was right around that same time. And I just, it didn't work out. So went into some non-wrestling stuff like selling real estate and other stuff that I didn't.
But what about the promotion you grew up on? When that you remain loyal, which is says a lot about you and the person that you are, and I respect that. But once the period is at the end of the sentence, listen, man, 99.9% of the wrestlers that I've worked with in this industry, the end game is the WWE. That's kind of why they got into business. Even working in Germany and Europe with those guys, it's the same thing. I would have to believe that once you knew, ECW's days were over and you got your release, that you had to have, you had to have the desire to live that dream and give the WWE, a go. No.
Well, for sure, yeah, and that would have been a dream. And that's one of the times that I talked to Terry Taylor, was before I got the contract to do TNN. It wasn't a contract to do TNN per se, but it was an ECW contract in late April of '99. And it was around the time that the Dudleys were going to be transitioning over to the WWF. And then I was going to start doing TNN in August. Before that contract came to be, I guess it was, maybe late '98 or earlier in '99, whenever it was, I had spoken with Terry Taylor, and I don't remember, but I reached out to him, and kind of a loose offer, not really, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was an actual offer of employment over the phone, but it was more along the lines of to see if what he might be able to put together would be of interest to me. He mentioned, what he thought my character could do there on WWF TV at the time, so who I'd be working alongside, and gave me an idea as to financially what the terms would be. And all of it sounded good compared to where I was prior to signing the contract and doing TNN. And who knows how it would have worked out. The act that I was going to be a part of, that he had mentioned at the time, didn't last. They were on TV, if I had to guess, I would say between 1 and 3 weeks. And so I don't know, but come 2001, why I might not have pursued more diligently the opportunity to go to the WWF, I don't know. That's anybody's guess. Maybe I wanted a little bit of a break, see what I could do outside of wrestling. Maybe it would be something that I could eventually bring to wrestling. I knew there wasn't anything that I would ever like more, but I don't know. I did reach out, and I don't know. I probably should have gone and visited friends backstage more, but I don't know. I think for as much of an extrovert as I am, I think there's also a part of me that just, I want to make sure that if I'm going to get a job and work somewhere, I want it to be on merit. Mm-hmm. And I almost, I like, there's a part of me that wants to be reached out to, but it's not, that can go both ways. It's not the ego where I think that it would be a dream, you know? Yeah. And I hope that, you know, it's weird. So the politics wise, I never wanted to be that guy that, you know, would go for two reasons: legitimately to visit friends that I hadn't seen in a handful of years, and also to see if I could have my dream job and you know, work there, and have it be misconstrued as, you know, I guess, you know, it's a business, so you shouldn't even worry about it being misconstrued because it is just what it is. But I was just always concerned, just kind of in the back of my mind, I just had like, you know, I don't want to be that guy. So
do you have any regrets today that you weren't more, you know, going after that dream?
If I was in-ring talent, if what I did was predominantly physical, I might, because I'm always, I don't like, you know, time's arrow, like one direction. And at that point, I'd be like, oh man, it's been 15 years since I was 25, so I missed my athletic prime. For me, though, as a talker and as kind of a wrestling historian and a wrestling psychologist, and somebody who also has gone out and done some sales and done some investing and that kind of thing, for me, I think I'm at my prime now. And because of that, that's the only reason I think why I don't have that regret.
So are you doing anything about it now?
Yeah, try. And I've reached out to a couple of some things. I'm going to be hanging out with some people at the Barclays Center this week. And you know, it's always WWE there. Are ahead. You know, I don't want to rest on my laurels. I don't want to just be an ECW original. I want to kind of, you know, dip my toe in whatever else is out there, both within the sphere of professional wrestling and also, you know, outside of it in the broader spheres of entertainment and business, and basically just, you know, do whatever makes sense that I could provide and be an asset to, you know. So we'll see.
Joe, are you as much of a fan in of today's business as, you know, the business that you grew up on, the business through ECW that you worked in? And I'll tell you, I'm just being honest with you, I'm not, because professional wrestling is three things to me. And it always has been. It's wrestling, it's characters, and it's storylines. Those were the three things that it was from the first time I ever saw a wrestling show, you know, all the way through, you know, Attitude Era. I tried to, you know, stay true to that, you know, during my TNA years, but it just seems to me like we're getting more and more and more away from the entertainment aspect, where we're not seeing refined characters. We're seeing a lot of guys just coming out looking like wrestlers. There's no character, there's no catchphrase, there's no gimmick. And, you know, every storyline seems to be, okay, these two guys don't like each other and they want to fight. So to me, you're really missing a lot of the major elements that made me be a fan, you know, of the wrestling business for the last 40 years. I don't know why it's going in that direction, but that's the direction that I feel that it's going in. Is that just me? Or somebody, you know, like I said, like yourself, you know, 15 years younger than me, really appreciated the entertainment aspect of it. Are you seeing that too, or is that just my take on it?
You know, I think it's a bigger world because, you know, back then I would have to watch U68 and I didn't have cable and it was a struggle. You know, you're buying the magazines and the newsletters and everything else. And I don't think you're seeing as much. And even a year or two ago, you weren't seeing as much. There weren't so many options. But now if you luck out and you have the right cable company or you have the right satellite dish or whatever it is that you're, I mean, in addition to the network and in addition to the fact that there's WWE and also their developmental sub-brand NXT that's big enough, I guess, that it's selling out Barclays. But now you've also got TNA and you've also got, it's linked with Global Force. And you've also got Lucha Underground and ROH. If you've got access, you've got Japanese wrestling in addition to your Mexican wrestling. You've got Galavision, then it's not just Lucha Underground, but it's actual Mexican wrestling. There's a lot of wrestling, you know, and so much so that I left a couple people out. But I mean, especially if you go to your indie shows or if you're buying your DVDs or however it is that you consume pro wrestling, there's a lot of it out there. So I think if your concern is even halfway to where you believe it to be, I think that's a problem only because there's more opportunity now. You know, it's easier to get on TV. You know, you've got Paragon Pro Wrestling on Pop, and they're owned by CBS and Lionsgate. You've got, Destination America is having, an 8 o'clock lead in for a 2-hour 9 o'clock show. And then they're experimenting and seeing, well, what would happen if we make the 8 o'clock show, the 11 o'clock show? I mean, there's so much wrestling out there. At the same time, though, it's getting easier to get your product. Everything else in entertainment, content is king. So if you're out there producing and if you're investing your time, your money, time away from your family, into putting together a show that you're hoping other people will be entertained by, you've got one opportunity. And if people don't find it entertaining, then, it doesn't make you a bad person. Maybe, you should be doing something else with your time. But the show should be varied enough, I think, that you can give everybody what they want. I mean, like you said, wrestling isn't just one thing. It's 3 things. For some people, that they might prefer only 1 or 2. They might be big into the what goes on inside the ropes, and for them, watching New Japan on Access, whether it's new footage or old footage, that kind of thing, real heavy work rate wrestling, and borderline spot fest wrestling. Some people they love they. At the same time, though, you've got people that love 10 different things about wrestling. They just asking them why they love wrestling is like asking them why they love Saturday Night Live or why they love pizza, because even when it's bad, it's good. So it kind of depends how you measure, you know what I mean? But I do think that every promotion that has the opportunity to have the exposure and be in people's homes, they need to appreciate that they serve a function and a purpose. And that's to give people not just their money's worth, because when you're watching on free TV, if you're not somebody who's being monetized right now, the concern isn't so much that you're getting your money's worth, but give people something that's worth their time. Because when we were growing up, the syndicated show was all squash matches. Mm-hmm. It was an infomercial. And it was designed to get you to spend your money out at the arena and go to the Garden, even though you could stay home and watch the Garden show every month for free on cable. You could watch it on your couch in your underwear. But the goal was that you were so into it that you had to be one of the 18,000 people that were going to be there in person. And that's why, a lot of our local people, like you were talking about, the New York local contingent who made up the ECW roster, all those guys, it's always kind of at that show. I was at that show. You were at that show too? Oh, we were in the same building before we even knew each other. That's like full circle 4 earlier in the show about January 86. It was available on free TV, but it was such an effective infomercial, even though it didn't give you much, right? Some weeks you had one main event, minutes long. Everything else was a 3-minute squash match, and there was a Piper's Pit. And there was, some Mean Gene inserts, local, and that's it. And it was effective. So, not everything has long. Not everything has to be at the level of a pay-per-view or a quarterly special. You've got 1-hour shows that are kind of hearkening back. But what you do have to do is not phone it in and not mail it in and really get out there and keep the fans entertained, because you might only have that one chance to do so. So, is it the same business? It's certainly not the same business. I think wrestling, every 3 months, wrestling isn't the same as it was 3 months earlier. But you really, I think as a fan, wrestling fans should not be jaded. I think there should be a golden rule aspect. They should give the promotions the opportunity to prove themselves, the same way the promotions should give the fans a level of respect and say, listen, let's go ahead and not assume that somebody's going to eat up this show and come back next week just because the word wrestling's in the title.
And I'll be honest with you, that's what I feel is happening. My biggest my biggest critique is the lack of effort. I'm sorry, that's the way I feel. I was in that spot, and I put a lot of years in that spot. And when I watch these shows every week, I'm literally walking away from them like, honestly, that's the best you can do. And I remember, being at the, during the Attitude Era, when the WCW and the WWE audience combined was over 10 million people on Monday nights. And that did not include ECW. Right. So when you look at today's product and it's 3.5 million, and okay, yes, I understand the landscape has changed and there's more cable channels and you can watch the show on your computer, yada, 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 yada. 7.5 million people are not watching the show on their computer. My biggest concern is they've run off the casual wrestling fan, like you said, the television viewer, the fans of television that wrestling was once cool and hip with, NWO, ECW, the Attitude Era, and you had everybody watching it because it was cool and hip. And those people have gone away. And my biggest concern with wrestling is I feel they've turned it into a niche show. And there's going to be a niche audience, and there's going to be those 3 million people, and the days of 10 million, 12 million are gone. And in my opinion, it's talent, bro. If you're a wrestler, you know this, Joel, better than anybody. Every wrestler, once they step between their ropes, are going to give 120%. I can maybe count on one hand in 20 years the time I ever saw a wrestler phone it in. They're always balls to the wall, the best performance they can give. That's a shoot. But to me, it's the effort being put in that a Paul Heyman put in or a Vince Russo put in, where, it's the blood and it's the sweat and it's the tears, writing every single segment of that show. I think it's kind of what you said. Well, we're going to assume wrestling's in the title and they're wrestling fans and they're going to watch this show every week, even if we sleepwalk through it. So that's what bothers me in this day and age, just the effort I see going into the show.
Yeah. You were inside my mind earlier in the podcast, and so I'm returning the favor now. While you were saying that, we were actually thinking about, I think, something very similar at the same time, because it doesn't so much matter, 3 million or so, or whether it's 10 million or so, when they're watching on free TV. As far as for the strength and the viability of the promotion, that metric almost doesn't matter. It only matters when it leads to monetization, not to think of the wrestling fans purely as customers or as dollar bills or that we're counting beans or anything like that. But at the end of the day, physically in the real world and how wrestling affects it, whether 3 million people are watching or 10 million, you can't get a sense unless you're looking at the numbers. You can get the sense here, though. When there were 10 million people watching, you'd walk out on the street and be in a non-wrestling specific environment. You'd be at the mall, you'd be at 7-Eleven, you'd be at the car dealership, you'd be at school, you'd be wherever you are, work, wherever. And you've got NWO shirts, The Rock, Goldberg, Austin, ECW, and the same way almost like the Marvel universe is now, or any of a number of different things. Wrestling, not to the extent that it was 15, 20 years ago at that moment. But it just seemed like, it wasn't niche. It just seemed like it was not only mainstream, but hot, trending, pervasive in the mainstream. Having 10 million people watch for free, it's like throwing spaghetti against the wall. Some will stick and some will not. less will stick just because it's a numbers game, just because it's a contact sport. And when you're only making contact with 3 million instead of 10 million, there's going to be 30% as many t-shirts, give or take, organically. It's just so to that extent, yeah, if wrestling, even though there are more shows on the dial, what wrestling needs to do is just, I think in the last 5 or 10 years, certainly as a microcosm, this is a golden age. But just like anything else and at any other time, if you ignore that fact, just like anything, if you ignore it, it's going to go away. And if everybody in the wrestling business doesn't take advantage of keeping the water boiling, so that we stick at that boiling point where we're not worried about the 7 million we lost, but we're saying we're going to retain everybody who's watching now, and we're going to get them to buy a ticket and bring a friend or a family member, that's when wrestling is successful.
You did. And I'll never forget, Joe, I was, so caught up as you were in the week to week grind that, bro, I didn't genuinely understand the growth and the height and the popularity of the business at the time. And I remember, Joe, I got like a little break and I brought my family to Universal Studios. And I remember literally getting off a ride, and it was like my eyes were opened. Every other person had an Austin 316 shirt on. And when I saw that with my own 2 eyes, I was like, holy crap. I mean, this is huge. So, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That's what that time was. Joe, let me ask you this, and we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. But Joe, listen, you are gifted. You were without a doubt one of the best at what you did. No question about it. And like you said, age is not a factor. You can do, come on. I was around the great Paul Bearer, for crying out loud. The guy was ageless. Bro, when the guy cut promos, literally tears came to my eyes. And I'm not even kidding you. So age has nothing to do with what you do. But are you a bit concerned, because when you look at the landscape in the business today and more of the emphasis is put on, the match and the in-ring product, and there seems to be less and less of a place for I hate to use the word managers, but a talking head to get the story across, because there are also lack of stories. Does that concern you, being that is your ultimate gift?
Thank you for that. Not really. A few years ago, like 5-10 years ago, before there was NXT and before, TNA had reached certain levels that it had, there was a time, however many years ago, that I remember being concerned, because it seemed like being an outside the ring person, there weren't so many hype men. There weren't so many male mouthpieces out there. There weren't so many Albano, Grand Wizard, Blassie, Heyman, Bobby Heenan guys out there. It seemed to be largely dominated by women, valets, and not, and that's great. For me, though, it just seemed like there wouldn't really be the place for a manager. And I wasn't worried about it as a female versus male thing. I was worried about it as every pro wrestler I thought was being looked upon to be a one-man band. And I thought maybe the sense of, yeah, well, he can really go and he's got a great gimmick and lots of charisma, but he can't talk, but that's okay because we'll give him a manager. I thought that had kind of maybe been changed to, if he can't talk, then we'll find somebody who has the other 4 attributes but can talk, and he'll get that spot. Mm-hmm. So I just didn't know that there was a place anymore for any kind of character, quintessential stud muffin or Joey Jaguar from before my ECW days, or anything else that I had done, along the lines of, or could do. I just didn't know if it was still an industry where I would be considered gifted or talented, because was I an asset and was I bringing anything to the table? And then that changed, because Paul Heyman came back as an agent with Brock and with CM Punk, and doing the agent gimmick, not just a pro wrestling manager, but kind of, being Arliss and doing what he does so well. And, things like that kind of reestablished for me that, just keep plugging along, keep doing what you're doing what you can do. It's a marketplace. If, you're only worth what somebody's willing to pay for you. And, if it is to be, then it's up to me. But at the same time, it can't, I can't ham fist my way back into, working full time in the wrestling business. I can let however many people I speak with, I can let it be known that I'd love nothing more than for that to be the case. But you can't put a square peg in a round hole. And I just, now that I do think again that I could bring something to the table. I think again that, time for me or age isn't a factor. The business is stronger than it's been, and there are more opportunities than there were 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm very optimistic and just willing to work as hard as, I'm willing to give that elevator pitch and, put myself on the line. When I'm at a gig, 12 hours, 15 hours doesn't matter to me, because I remember, there was one day where it was ECW on TNN taping day. And I make sure that I tell this story every time I teach a seminar, because I want the kids to know right there whether the business of professional wrestling is for them or not. And I tell a story about how it was the day to do ECW on TNN, and all that meant for me was having to get in the car and drive about an hour and 15 minutes to Westchester from Connecticut. And there was something going on. I was in a bad mood. I wasn't feeling well. I don't remember the exact, the circumstance, but I remember completely the antithesis of anything that's like me. I remember thinking to myself, oh man, production's today. I wish it was like tomorrow or the next day, because just today, like I just wish, I wish I didn't need to go do this right now. And like 4 months later, it was all done. And that's why, I always think to myself, about wrestling and everything else, if you ignore it, it'll go away. And also you don't know what you got till it's gone. Yeah. And I always make sure I tell that story, because, great, I'm 40 years old, and great, maybe I should have been pursuing certain aspects of my career more than I have in the last 5, 10, 15 years. Great, all of these things. But at the same time, you're only as good as your last performance, and your next performance needs to be treated like an audition every single time. So I'm going to go out there and that's whatever wrestling work I do, that's just always the level that I'm going to turn it up to. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I mean, those are some really strong words. I get it. Trust me. Let me ask you this, Joe. You're doing most of your work now in the Connecticut area with MXW. Is that correct? Can you tell me a little bit about that promotion?
Yeah, MXW started in 2004, and that's a promotion that I was pretty much, kind of booking, promoting, basically doing by and large, 90% of it. And I'm a perfectionist, I think, and wanted it to be what I envisioned it to be. And that's a mistake sometimes, to feel like you need to compete on a certain level when you don't have the war chest, or when you don't have the time, or when you don't have the staffing or any, certain other resources. So it was tough for me to, I always in my head was living in MXW, in MXW year 3 when it was MXW year 1, in MXW year 7 when it was MXW year 3. And, and that's kind of along the lines of what I say, like, it's a reason why I think I'm, closest to being in my prime maybe now, certainly on TV, 18 years ago, whenever in my early 20s. I think on the whole, I'm in my prime now because there's a lot of lessons outside the ring and about the business and the industry, and just the promotion of professional wrestling, the marketing of professional wrestling. There's a lot that you can learn. You've got to go out and run a show where you've got the greatest talent that you could ever hope for on the show, and you've put money into buying the ad avails on cable TV, and you're advertising 2 weeks before the show on Raw, on TNA, on ECW, on Sci-Fi, and then there's 48 paid, and you're doing it at an iconic, rock concert building, that only holds 750 anyway, so that's all. You were only hoping for a few hundred, you only needed 125 to pay the boys, and you got 48. There's a lot of humbling, there's a lot of humility, there's a lot of discipline. It's such a multifaceted business that, that's why, it's cute and it's worth a smile when you see somebody in a Facebook comment say that they could do it better than a Vince McMahon or a Vince Russo or a Dixie Carter but at the end of the day, I remember Ed Ferrara was on Prodigy at the same time that I was, and obviously you worked with him quite a bit, and he wanted to get into the wrestling business, and I was barely in it myself, but I knew kind of where different schools were in different parts of the country, and he was a college educated, brilliant writer. He's a professor now.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, he's a professor at Full Sail University. How about that?
Is that right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, but so we were talking, and I think at the time, he told me he was writing for Weird Science, and he said he wanted to get into pro wrestling, but he was based in California, doing his stuff, writing for TV, and I had mentioned Slammer's Wrestling Gym, but just so many people, it takes such a kind of brilliant, diverse mind. You have to have your finger on the pulse of the public and know what people want to see or hear. You have to have an attentiveness to detail so that it's real, but it's still fantastical. And it can't be too thorough or verbose where you lose part of the audience. You have to be your own continuity guy. You know what I mean? It's just so intensive, and it can burn you out. And so, when I see somebody in a Facebook comment say that they could do it better, and meanwhile they're saying this as somebody who is, maybe 15, 16 years old and hasn't ever tried it. I love all wrestling fans, but it's tough, because you kind of, I think there's a reason why we all call ourselves brotherhoods, and it's kind of this, fraternity of the traveling tights, is because, you have to be involved, I think, in the business to really get a full grasp of what it is.
Well, Joe, this has been a enjoyable conversation with me. I mean, I really loved your insights and your experience, and I mean it, bro. When I say, what you did and what you still do. I mean, in my opinion, it's a lost art, and I think there's a lot to, what's old is new again. It's funny when I made the comments, about wrestling the way I knew it, is dead. And, I started getting, the negative tweets and whatnot. As I went back and started blocking these people, I could see that a lot of their, Twitter profiles and the pictures and whatnot, they, like you said, they were teenagers and kids. So I immediately started realizing they had no idea what I was talking about. When I talk about the Albanos and the Piper's Pits and the Grand Wizards and, superstar Billy Graham, they never saw any of that. So they don't even understand what I'm comparing it to. So that's why there's such a part of me that would love for some of the fans today to kind of see that art form of what wrestling used to be, in my opinion, in its finest form. And I think that, you were, in like I said, in the late 1900s, 2000s, you were a mirror image of, that aspect of the business at its absolute best. And there's no doubt, like you said, here we are, 2015. I think you could go out there and do it in your sleep. And I honestly mean that from the bottom of my heart.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
Now, Joe, if people want to follow you on Twitter, they want to follow MXW, give them the best places, the addresses where they could get a hold of you. They could see what's going on in your career.
Yeah, thank you so much. MXW is on a bit of a hiatus, but yeah, it's MXW Wrestling, and you can learn about some of the past. We've had a lot of great talent. It was completely based on merit. A lot of great action. ROH guys, Chikara, PWG, a lot of guys that went on to TNA and NXT and WWE. Lots of great shows. Probably, again, because the way we ran MXW, probably too great, too soon. But for the fans, that's a great thing. So MXW Pro Wrestling. For me, my Twitter is at MXW Wrestling. My Facebook is my personal page. The friend page is MXW Joel Gertner. And if that's maxed out, it's sometimes easier to get into my fan page, my like page. And that's / the real QSM Joel Gertner. QSM standing for Quintessential Stud Muffin. Instagram is going to be Quintessential Stud Muffin. Periscope's going to be just like the Twitter. I just started doing that last week, like a lot of people are, and that's also MXW Wrestling.
When am I coming into this MXW for me and you to go back and forth on the microphone, Joe?
Well, tell me more.
Bro, listen. I was going through my notes. I saw that you had a little cup of coffee at TNA on 2 occasions. I don't think I was there for either one.
You were there for at least one, maybe both. I was there for the first 2 or 3 weeks during the weekly pay-per-view days. Right. So I was there for the first Huntsville, Alabama show. Wow. And I was there for the first Nashville Fairgrounds show. And I can't remember if you and Ed were there then. I think you were. It was so. That was my first, talking about structure and just how different shows are formatted and how they run, whether it's with a script or without and everything else. It was completely foreign to me to do any wrestling TV at the time that wasn't ECW. So it was, I don't think I was ever in any part of the room for more than 5 or 10 minutes. And so much of it was just kind of a blur. But I think you might have been there, and I might have met you for the first time for that. And then if you were at Hardcore Justice in 2010, the ECW reunion, and I think I might have seen you backstage sitting at the soundboard or at a table somewhere, and I saw you. We made eye contact. We nodded at each other. Next thing I probably did was go through the curtain and perform, and it might have been the only time I saw you all night. You're kind of like,
Well, that's unfortunate, but we got to talk here today because I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. I thoroughly enjoyed the insights, and I thoroughly enjoyed you as a fan and everything you did during your ECW days, as I'm sure everybody watching this interview right now did.
Thanks a lot for that. I mean, that means everything. I really appreciate you reaching out and having me on too. That's great, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to talk, and hopefully not to put you on the spot. We spoke about this when we first spoke a week or so ago on Twitter, but I would love to have you on my new podcast, the 69-Minute Eargasm, as one of our first ever guests. I just think, for me growing up, listening to the Pro Wrestling Spotlight and then finally getting into the business and, having a decent 20, 25 years since then, and same can be said for you. And I think we could do an episode where it's just hometown boys made good.
Joe, let me tell you something, and I'm not going to mention any names. See, as I get older, I don't mention names anymore. In the past, I would have buried people, right? But Joe, I'll be honest with you. I've been on a lot of these big shot podcasts, and it's always you do my podcast, and then I'll come and do yours. So, of course, Vince the sucker goes and does everybody's podcast, and then when I look for them to return the favor, they're no place to be found. You, my friend, have my absolute word. Whenever you're ready for me to come on that show, you just let me know, and I will be there wearing belts.
I I appreciate that more than you know. I can't wait. That's going to be a lot of fun. But
And
yeah.
I'm only saying that because I know you're going to make a return visit here because I know we have so much more to talk about.
That would be great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks for joining us, everybody. I'll see you right here next week.